Well, let's go now to that theme of the European elections, which begin next week. Voting begins here in the UK and in the Netherlands in a week from now and continues in the other 25 member states until Sunday the 7th of June. Well, we have a panel of bloggers here with us to unpick some of the issues that might arise. They are James Clive Matthews of Nosemonkey's EUTopia, Helen Samueli of EU Referendum, and Alan Thomas of Shiraz, Socialist. We'll hear from them in a moment. First, a quick look at their websites.
When I gave the word, now in the morning I sleep alone, sweep the streets I used to own. I used to roll the dice, feel the fear in my enemy's eyes. Listen as the crowd would sing. Now the old king is dead, long live the king. 1 minute I held the key.
Well, those three bloggers join us now live, and I'm going to go to Alan Thomas of Shiraz Socialist first. Alan, not a good time to be a politician, really, is it? I mean, when you see what's been going on in the United Kingdom, people are rather off them all, aren't they?
Well, yeah, it's not a good time to be a mainstream politician, that's absolutely for sure. I mean, I rather think it's a case of issues that they've brought upon themselves in the main, and I think that has a great deal to do with the clubbable atmosphere within the House of Commons. I do think, actually, that minor parties will do well at this election, however. I think that protest vote will happen.
Okay, do you think that's the case, James? I mean, people are going to be put off by the big parties?
It does seem like it, certainly from the most recent polls. But the major thing that does seem to be the case at the moment is nobody knows how this election is going to go, because we've still got these MP expenses revelations coming out every day. We've had more MPs resigning this afternoon, and that is going to impact on the European elections, even though MEPs and MPs are often quite different beasts.
But people also think they've got big fat expenses as well.
Well,
on a kind of gravy train. They were cleaned up a few years ago, but they're still pretty impressive.
There's still quite a lot of MPs. I mean, the pay for MEPs is going up, I think, after these elections. There's going to be a load of kerfuffle about the expenses there as well going on, because they still haven't quite released everything. There have been a few MEPs being caught up in expenses scandals themselves. A couple of Tory MEPs had to resign recently. So,
Helen, what do you think about all this? I mean, do you think that it might help the smaller parties, or could it just induce voter apathy?
Well, it's actually one of the probably the only interesting European election ever since we've had European elections, because we actually don't know what's going to happen. Normally you can more or less predict it. I mean, last time you couldn't predict the Kilroy factor, which brought out people to vote for UKIP.
But you're talking about Robert Kilroy-Silk,
yes,
the former Labour MP who stood
and
in
he
Britain,
stood for UKIP, and that actually...
That's the UK Independence Party, yeah.
Actually a surprising number of people in Europe know about it. I'm always surprised when people write into to our blog. But what we can't determine at this stage is, certainly in Britain, how many people will just say, oh, a plague upon all their houses, I'm going to stay at home. And normally, of course, turnout in Britain for the European election is around 35%. In the last European election it was 38%. It could actually go back to 30%, or it could suddenly, because people want to say, we're going to hit them, and we'll go up to 40, 45.
I mean, Alan, that's a big key thing, isn't it? I mean, these parliamentary elections in Europe take place against the worst recession for decades, 70 years maybe, and people are beginning to blame their politicians for getting everybody into this mess.
Yes, absolutely. I think that as has just been said, the turnout was on its way down anyway. And I think there's a genuine sense of anger towards politicians. I think that primarily is a byproduct of the recession, whereas the MPs' expenses issue's almost been the icing on the cake. People did blame politicians for that. They did blame this very idea that there was no possibility for the state to intervene in the economy, for that being, so, you know, the whole laissez-faire ethic. And now it turns out that at the same time people were milking the state for second mortgages. Obviously they're not going to be happy, are they?
No, James, but just seeing what people think about the European Parliament. I mean, what's your experience and what people, how they respond to your blog? I mean, do they understand how the Parliament works?
I don't think anybody, including quite a few MEPs, understand quite how the EU works. It's incredibly complicated, mind-numbingly boring. There's hardly any way to find out decent information on it. It's rarely covered in the press, in the media. You don't hear about anything that goes on in Brussels or in Strasbourg, apart from when there's some kind of little scandal. So we had the MEP expenses thing a few months back. There was a brief item on the news that lasted for about 3 or 4 minutes, and that was it. We didn't hear anything more about it for ages. We've got a new European Commissioner came in to replace Peter Mandelson a few months ago. I haven't seen her mentioned in the press ever since. It's bizarre. There's just no information. There's no way you can find out about it.
Peter Mandelson was Trade Commissioner, replaced by Baroness Ashton.
Baroness Ashton, who we've heard nothing since.
Oh, well. Okay, yeah, Helen, do you think that there is perhaps a need, and that maybe you could overcome voter apathy if there was more understanding about the European Parliament and how it connects with the Council of Ministers and the Commission? People don't know that, for instance, the Parliament doesn't initiate legislation.
Doesn't initiate, and it doesn't actually legislate at all. So if people actually found that out, they wouldn't vote at all, I should think, because they would say, why bother? I don't agree there is no information. There is no information in the British media, and that I think is shocking. The few newspapers that have anything, and the few TV programs that have anything, always treated the European Union as foreign news, which is completely wrong, since the European Union legislates for us, so it's domestic news. But the information is there on the European Union website. We know the European Parliament doesn't actually do anything because it is there described.
Well, I mean, that's
detail.
a bit unfair, because it does help to actually shape legislation with the Council of Ministers.
It does, but in the Commission can usually
of course, but it does help shape.
It does help
3/4 of EU legislation. I just want to bring Alan Thomas in at this stage. Alan Thomas, on that point of people's understanding of how it works, I mean, generally, do people actually see the European Parliament as an extension of national politics? And so they're not quite sure, maybe, if you have a Labour member of the European Parliament, do they vote according to a centre-left bloc in the Parliament or according to what the Labour Party at Westminster says?
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't think people vote in European elections on European issues at all. I can't recall an election when they did. It's virtually always for the vote or a referendum on the government of the day. And that, as a result, you saw Conservative representation fall during the 90s, and you're now seeing Labour representation fall at the same time. I think that's just part and parcel of the whole process of elections in the first place. But further, I think it is actually a byproduct of the powerlessness of the European Parliament.
Very briefly to all of you, James, do you think that people need to engage more with Europe? I mean, do they want to? Do you get any feeling that that's what they'd like?
Every now and again, yes, but the lack of information makes it very hard. There are ways of finding out about what's going on, and I'd encourage everyone to do that. Hunt around the internet. Don't believe everything you read on the internet as ever, especially not blogs. We're all useless. So just hunt things down and try and get your facts right and make an informed decision. There's various websites out there. There's EUprofiler.eu and votematch.eu. I'd recommend everyone to go there and find out who they should go for.
Briefly, Helen, what do you think? What does your blog tell you about what people are thinking? Briefly.
I think people are getting more and more annoyed about the European Union having so much power in Britain and not being accountable to the British people.
Okay, Alan Thomas, last few words, 10 seconds.
Sure, I think we actually need to strengthen European institutions, and I think the collapse of GM today, with all the negotiations being conducted in Germany, merely goes to show how isolating ourselves won't help.
Okay, Alan Thomas of Shiraz, Socialist, Helen Samueli of EU Referendum, and James Clive Matthews of Nosemonkey's EUTopia. Great name, by the way. Thank you all very much indeed.